really dry.
But these are all trees.
Anything that's not colored,
Ozarks.
yeah, anything that's not colored orange is going to be forest of some sort.
All right.
Now, when you look at the map, you pop back down here to southeast Missouri, and you see little pockets of orange, and it's in the wettest part of the state. In fact, the interesting thing about Missouri is that there's differences in rainfall. And if you take a look at southeast Missouri, it has the highest rainfall of any other part of the state. On average, we have 48 inches of rain per year. As you continue to move in a northwesterly direction, the rainfall becomes less and less. Prairies actually thrive in drier areas, whereas trees need a lot of water. It takes a lot of water to grow a tree. So that's why the Ozarks and southeast Missouri grow much bigger trees. In fact, southeast Missouri and the Boot Heel grew some of the largest timber we've ever seen in the state. And if you ever get a chance to look at old photographs, you'll see enormous trees being hauled out on train trestles, and just phenomenal.
And on ox carts.
Yeah.
Yes.
Enormous timber, a wonderful place to grow trees. In fact, this is the best place to grow trees in the whole state because of the soil, the water, and the warmth. Well, that's why it's so weird to have the prairie down here in southeast Missouri, because prairies are typically drier communities. Well, the reason you're able to have some of these prairies has everything to do with the soil and the sand that's in there. A lot of people who have ever walked across a sandy beach knows that sand can get hot. Well, that hot also makes things really dry. And we have a couple of ridges here in southeast Missouri. One of them is known as the Malden Sand Ridge, and it runs approximately right through here in this area of Dunklin County into Stoddard. And we have another ridge that runs from Benton, Missouri down to New Madrid, and this one is called the Sykeston Sand Ridge. And there are little sandy pockets throughout southeast Missouri that are appropriate for prairie. And this is a very conservative map. When Schroeder was doing his work, if a surveyor used the word prairie, he marked that section down as prairie. But if they said the word grassland or open grassy area, he didn't count it. And as I was reviewing some of the maps you had access to, there's a little section down here called Little Prairie. And that is not mentioned on this pre-settlement map. So what that tells me is that either the surveyor didn't call it a prairie, or it was already settled and farmed. And the reason that would have already been settled and farmed is because you don't want to build your house in the middle of a swamp that floods on a regular basis, and you certainly want to be able to keep your crops remotely dry to a certain extent. So keeping the water out was a big problem at that time period. So they would settle on the highest possible ridge, and down here in this part of the world, that was the Sand Ridge.
All right, and even as late as 1920, 1930, they would have to take their cotton they grew down here in Dunklin County. They'd go in caravans to pull through the mud holes up around White Oak, the spreads of the Chillicothe River. And it would take a lot of farmers and a lot of teams to get those wagons up that Sand Ridge all the way to Dexter.
That's right. And as you mentioned that, getting things up and down, there was a lot of travel up and down the sand ridges. On occasion, they would try to cross the little river in between these two sand ridges, and that was typically done on a pole road. If you didn't do that, you would have to go all the way up through Crowley's Ridge, and then you would again have to cross a pole road here around Advance to get over into the Benton Hills. And if you wanted to go to Cape Girardeau, you had to cross another pole road to get through here. And when you got up to this portion, you were on the King's Highway. The Spanish had a road that ran up and down through the river hills up here, crossed a pole road, went across the Benton Hills, went down the Sykeston Sand Ridge to go to New Madrid. And that's how the Spanish kept information going from St. Louis down to their fort in New Madrid.
Now, didn't they call that El Camino Real?
Yeah, that's the Spanish word for it. El Camino Real is the King's Highway. When you look at this map, you'll see a lot of orange in the northern and the western side of the state, and even some blurbs down in southeast Missouri. But when you look at how much prairie exists today, we're looking at less than 4% of prairie in the whole state. So
what would you say it is here?
Right now, this
50%, 45%?
About 45% of the state is prairie,
and
historically.
Now it's 4%.
If that.
Well, now see, the prairie over here in the Caruth area is all in farmland. You wouldn't know if you looked. You couldn't possibly discern where prairie was.
Right. And that's something that the reason the Department of Conservation is so concerned about that is that it's really good wildlife habitat. If you have a sand prairie and you may not be able to grow any crops on it, it still has a lot of value to bobwhite quail, who have to have exactly that kind of habitat with a lot of grass and open area. It's also good for mourning doves, rabbits. Deer take their fawns out there to browse. Deer love to eat grass and all kinds of different wildflowers. So these things have not only a history to us, but they have a value to our wildlife that we have traditional values of going out and hunting and enjoying and photographing and just listening to. So it's important for us to identify whatever sand prairie is out there and nurture it a little bit. Bring it back, because that's part of who we are.
The difference in the settlement, of course, I understand the mountains and the hills and the Ozarks, but the areas of prairie in the swamp,
Yeah.
how did that happen?
Well, the reason you have prairie in southeast Missouri has everything to do with the elevation of these sand ridges. First of all, the sand gets hot. It also acts like a sieve. Any water that gets on the sand is going to soak through very quickly down to the water table. And because these ridges are somewhat elevated, and when I say elevated, I'm talking about at most 30 feet above the water table, as opposed to where you can dig a post hole.
We're really low down here.
Well, you dig a post hole and you can get into the water table pretty easy, so to speak. Well, these elevated sand ridges, they're going to drain their water quickly. The sun is going to heat it up, so it's going to become a very dry and desert-like condition. Well, that allows for plants that like that kind of stuff to grow there as opposed to trees. Some trees like that. The other thing that happened, a lot of southeast Missouri's history was influenced by the natives, and the natives that lived on these sand ridges, which built a lot of the mounds that we can still see by driving around the countryside, those mounds were built very close to prairie, and they would burn that prairie off to chase animals. They would use that to increase the seed production because they ate a lot of seeds off the prairie. And that fire helps to reduce the number of trees. Well, if you don't have a lot of trees, you have a lot more prairie, and it tended to be a pretty good resource for the natives as well.
Okay, so it was to their advantage to burn that off every few years.
A lot of your prairies were managed by fire and continue to be managed like that today by the department or other land agencies. And the reason fire is so important from a historical standpoint is because the natives would use that to clear out underbrush. They're bow hunting, and you don't want a lot of things in the way of your arrow. It's also a very valuable tool for managing the land to increase your production of seeds. If you're going to eat the seeds of some of these prairie plants, the best way to make them bloom and produce a lot of seeds is to actually burn it during the dormancy period. That spurs on better production. Fire was also used as a warfare tool and as a hunting tool. You could drive game with a fire, or if you wanted to set fire to a neighboring village and just run it through the prairie. And when a prairie fire gets going, we're not talking about a fire that's 5 to 10 feet tall. We're talking about flames that can get 20 and 30 feet tall. And that's in a tall grass prairie. Now, a short grass prairie like we have in, say, Scott County, that fire is going to get, 10 to 15 feet high, and it's very hot. You're going to stand back. If the flames are 30 feet tall, you're going to get 30 feet back away from this. So a prairie fire moves fast, it's hot, and it's frightening if you're on the receiving end of it. And it could be a pretty intimidating thing. It's going to be good for driving game. It's going to be good for getting back at your neighbor if you were in a warfare situation back then. Well, that's the history of our prairies. They burned on a regular basis. Or there were opportunities for fires to start naturally, but a lot of it did happen. All right. We have a couple of pictures here that came from Scott County, an area that has a lot of sand and not as much organic material like you would see down here in the Malden Plain. To my right, or I'm sorry, to my left, you have a sand prairie, and there's a lot of grass in that. That picture was taken in early September. And the grass that grows there, if you drive along the interstate, you can see this grass in September. It has a silvery seed head, and during the early and late evening hours, it reflects the sunlight, and it's really got an attractive look to it. And it's something that we're promoting as a landscape item because it does very well in the sandy soil.
Now, did the Indians eat this grain?
They didn't eat the grass. They would eat other things such as
not the
goose.
grain.
No, they would eat goosefoot, or they might eat blazing star seed or any kind of a native sunflower. They didn't eat the grass seed, but the wildlife that's out there does eat the grass seed. And just to give you a little more information about these prairies and why fire is so important, when you burn off all that dead vegetation, let's say you do this in late February, it'll look like an ashtray. It's just ugly. Nobody wants to see this, but that makes the ground black. Well, the sunlight hits that blackened soil with all that ash, and it starts to heat things up a little quicker than it would otherwise. Well, plants respond to that warmth pretty well, and they get a jump start on their growth. Plus, you have all that ash, which has taken the locked up nutrients and carbon that's there, and it's made it immediately available to the bacteria, to the plants, and so it starts growing because of the temperature, and it starts growing because of all of this available nutrients. Well, then it starts to grow. It's tender, it's growing fast, and that's great for bugs, or it's great for animals that eat on the plants. Well, bugs may not seem like a real big deal to you unless you're a quail or a turkey chick or a deer. They want tender vegetation.
Prairies in the swamp. That's been the subject tonight, and the gentleman who knows what he's talking about is A.J. Henderschot, and has come down to visit us from Cape Girardeau, and we appreciate you bringing maps and telling us about
wonderful.
this.
I appreciate the opportunity. This is a good chance to talk about conservation and something that's right here in our backyard.
And he likes to talk about it, I can tell. Thank you.
You're welcome.